Around. I've recharged all the food, so there's plenty more fudge, Rocky Road, and tarts to go around. So please help yourselves, as well as some more chive and cheese scones. So welcome back again, everybody. And I'd like to ask Professor John Marshall Reeve to introduce today's brown bag speaker. Thank you.
All right. For the double header, second
Yes.
game of the double header. To use a baseball analogy, if you don't know baseball. I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Anja, Henke and she works with a big team of researchers in University of Potsdam. That's near Berlin, Germany. Part of it, because she's been here, Rebecca Lazarus has visited us. They're part of a team. One thing I'd say about Anja is I think she's a classic emotion researcher, as you'll see today, meaning that she does more than just give people self-report questionnaires. She's going to give a multimodal kind of presentation. So she's going to look at emotions in learning multidimensionally, meaning physiologically, self-report, eye track, you name it. We'll see.
Thank you, Joe Marshall.
Thank you, and everybody, thank you for being here and taking the time out of the day to listen to my presentation. As already said, I'm Anja Henke. I'm from the University of Potsdam. That's in Germany, so it's been quite some trip here. And at the moment, I'm also associated as a visiting scholar with ACU, so John Marshall, so thank you for having me, as well as the University of Sydney through Helen Ward. So today I'll be talking about a study that we have done with Jason Harley and Negar Martin from McGill University in Canada. So we're kind of spanning the whole globe here in a way, almost. But just a few words about So that is our campus in Potsdam. We are currently having autumn and we have a very big So those are just the PhD students and the postdocs. And for those of you who remember, that is Rebecca there. She's my supervisor for my PhD, which should be finished within the next few months, hopefully. The entire team is mainly focusing on motivational research, emotional research, and all of that within the context of learning and instruction. So we have colleagues that focus on teacher interaction in school. We have colleagues that focus on pre-service teachers. And then we have colleagues that focus on students. And then there's also a small sub-part of the team who work with social robots, adaptive learning technologies, and all of that. My PhD and my main interests lie in emotions and learning. I'm also part of the team that is dealing with adaptive learning technologies and a bit of social robots, but not that much anymore. Generally, I'm very interested in using multimodal data to model dynamic processes, to look at ecological classroom settings, and a bit into individual differences in need. And today's presentation, which is about a study that's also part of my PhD, is spanning basically all of these except for the individual differences in needs. That's a bit less of a focus. Okay, emotions during learning. I'm very sure you're very familiar with the control value theory, but just to give you a brief introduction in case you aren't. So control value theory assumes that emotions are central to learning. They will be impacting learning behavior, motivation, and learning outcome, and everything is basically interrelated recursively. More recently, we've seen some additions to the theory, particularly the situative term, and also more increasingly in research viewing emotions as multi-component phenomena. Generally, it is assumed that positive emotions will be beneficial to learning, whereas negative emotions will not. For example, we have a lot of research that shows that when we have learners and they experience mainly negative emotions, their learning behavior will not be as good for learning, not be as conducive for learning, and also they will perform lower. So to make that a bit more visual, learners, for example, will have less attention that they use on the task. The learning strategies will not be as nicely adapted to the task needs. and then they will have lower learning outcome, whatever that may be. That can be academic achievement, that can also be motivational outcomes, like that. Whereas the opposite will be true for positive emotions. But emotions are not as simple as like, okay, how do you feel? And then learners will say something. There's several components to emotional experiences. And those are mainly affect, cognition, physiology, motivation, and expression or behavior. So if we look at this person here, the idea is like this person is thinking about a test, maybe a maths test, that's something that's often studied, and they're anxious about the test. So in terms of effect, they might have some uneasy feelings, they don't feel great. And then at the same time, they're worried to fail because they haven't studied, maybe they forgot that there's a test, now they're worried I fail. That is the cognitive aspect of it. In terms of physiology, and I'm sure you all had some situations where you were anxious, maybe like when you have to give a talk or something like that, and then there will be something happening inside you. It's very hard to grasp, but maybe your heart rate will increase, feel a bit like jittery, like you will have some physiological response that is often referred to as arousal or activation. Motivation aspects of test anxiety could be the idea of avoiding the test situation. So maybe thinking about, okay, maybe I can be sick, maybe I can pretend to be sick or anything like that. And then expression of anxiety will be, I hope it looks anxious to the person, is often what teachers then will easily see in the classroom. That facial expression suggests emotion. What? Yeah, almost. So generally, again, we would expect that these different components of emotional experiences are distinctive for different emotions, and that they all kind of fall in this group. Now, if it's negative, then the arousal state will impede learning, and if it's positive, the arousal state will be conducive to learning, or other achievement emotions such as boredom, negative emotions, or surprise. Okay,
It's just a thunderstorm.
just a
All right.
thunderstorm.
We're safe. We're safe.
Okay, so again, generally, there's a rule of thumb. And in terms of street emotions, benefit or not benefit learning, but for arousal, the research is a bit unclear. There's research that shows that arousal or affective activation, this physiological response, can be beneficial to learning if it's high. Another research shows it actually impedes learning if it's high. We further have high variability of emotions on the situation and the person level. And then what we kind of focus on is this part that arousal and activation may actually drain cognitive resources. You might also, I mean, if you think about the last time you were in love, maybe, or the first time you were in love, you might not have been able to focus so much on school, not because the task was too hard and you had some certain emotional response to the task, but generally your affective arousal was so high because you had these extreme intense emotions and you just could not focus. So that's what we are focusing in, on in the study. And then also in addition to that, it's not usually one emotion that is present exclusively, it's often several emotions. And each emotion has its own profile of these different components. So we have different levels of different components of different emotions all together. Makes it very complicated, but also very interesting. And so we're trying to take that apart a bit. And we do that using digital or technology enhanced learning settings. They have several benefits, but more recently, emotion research has kind of entered the domain of technology enhanced learning and instruction. It's not just become more relevant, but it's also become a topic to research. So one main question that we often find is what emotions do learners actually experience while they learn with these type of technologies? So maybe it's negative, maybe it's bored. And we also see a lot of research on how can we improve learners' emotions during these type of exercises. So that's pretty similar to any type of research on emotion in schools. But what's quite interesting is if the research is trying to use these computers that are affect aware, so that like these technologies can somehow get information on emotional states of learners and use that to adapt to the learner's emotional needs and then through such depth technologies, improve emotional experiences and thus improve learning. I also like these technologies, not just because they sound fancy and they seem super cool. I mean, sometimes they're very complicated and annoying to use, but they're very nice for doing research. So they allow us to integrate experience sampling very, very easily. I'm not sure who of you has done experience sampling in classrooms. Okay, so one typical approach with experience sampling, what that actually is, I'll come to in a second. With experience sampling, you ask learners maybe every 10 minutes, every 20 minutes, once a day, or anything like that, about their emotional experiences. And that's usually done by using a phone. And the phone will have some software and it will give a ping, and that indicates the learner to answer a quick questionnaire. And that can be a bit tedious in classrooms, like they need to have their phones out and then maybe they ignore because they're so focused on the task and they don't see that or it makes a noise. So with these adaptive learning technologies, we usually have some type of iPad or computer, or maybe a social robot with a tablet even in the classroom. And that's very easy to just ping them on the screen that they're using anyway. So it will come right into their faces basically, and they can easily respond to that. And also, nicely enough, these software often allow us to analyze or to collect behavioral data by means of log file data. So we don't need to sit in front of a computer where we have video recordings of learner behavior. No, we actually already have it in it's very nice to deal with that data because it's just a lot. But we have this very, very intensive data of what we're doing. It can be like a mouse click or just where the cursor moves, how much time they spend on a task. It's very, very wide ranging, the type of data we have. And we have that as contextual data to see what the learner is doing. We have timestamps of all that data so we can have a better understanding of the context of emotional experiences, motivation processes, anything like that. And I know you have a very nice lab here, and that makes it very easy. However, we also kind of took that upon us that there's a lack of ecological validity in these lab settings. They offer us incredible data quality, but it's been like questioned a bit if we can always transfer that to the classroom. But in the same sense, we should ask ourselves, can we also transfer these type of data analysis to the classroom? Because it's is tricky, to say the least, and you will have some validity issues with your data. I quickly talked about this already, so this is just a visual representation of experience sampling. As I said, learners will be pinged, but you can also do that with other types of population. It doesn't need to be learners, where you just ping them and then they will respond how strong you experience certain emotions. There can be other questions. It can just shouldn't be too long because you don't want them to answer a 20-minute question. You just want really quick answers. In terms of emotional research, that can be useful because it is what the learners are feeling. But also more recently, there was research showing that if we ask them, what are you feeling, that has actually impact on the strength or the level of certain emotions. And also, we may not be able to capture all of the components using these type of questionnaires. There is research done on these, and it's been published, and it's valid to ask them how activated do you feel, all of that. But sometimes it's also hard for learners to, especially young learners, to assess these type of feelings. They sometimes find it hard to give a proper answer to that. So what you can do is use electrodermal activity measurement. Anybody ever done that? Okay, no problem. Electrodermal activity is a type of measurement that measures the skin conductors, for example, on your hand or on your forehead, on your feet. There's some special type of sweat glands that are not as reactive to heat, physical activity, but towards something that is related to stress. So basically, affective activation or arousal. And these devices, they look pretty similar to this smartwatch here. It will be, or often it will be some kind of wristband. And some of them, or most of them, will have some cables coming from a sensor that will be connected to the palm, because these are, like here, you will find these special sweat glands here, but it's a bit tricky to sometimes put on, and the feet are very, very tricky to get learners to put on electrodes. So we also use that. And it will be connected there, and it will continuously measure the skin conductance until either we stop the measurement or the battery runs out. Oh. Did I do something?
Oh. I just got away for 1 minute.
Like past now. Yeah. So that is a continuous measurement during the whole learning session or however long you will, and I said until the battery runs out. And it gives you a measurement of how activated a learner is. It does not give you a measurement of discrete emotions or valence. Some studies are trying to achieve that. Some researchers are trying to achieve that. And maybe in the future, maybe using AI, that will be possible. But right now, we only know it's a good measurement of affective activation, particularly since there's no little association between EDA measurements and other types of measurements, such as the experience sampling self-reports. Or maybe just because it's never forward. And maybe just like a quick information on these, like this is actually how the data will look like if you look at it on the screen. You will have these peaks, and the more peaks there are, basically the more aroused the person is. And these peaks are considered or called skin conductance responses. So the more peaks, the more responses, the more increases or sudden increases in skin conductance, the higher stress. That has to do with the sweat on the skin, basically. So we have this, often we have this interval data from the experience sampling, and then we have the continuous data. And beautifully, we have the context of the situations that it was collected in by means of log file data. It doesn't need to be log file data. It can also be that you recorded students and you code their behavior. But log file data is just very neat and very rich. Yeah. So that was enough about why this type of technology is great for researchers, but it's also great for learners, actually. So we're not just using it to get our research and have a nice study. No, but actually these type of technologies, particularly intelligent tutoring systems, or short ITS, they have been studied quite some time, and meta-analyses show that they can be just as effective as human tutors. So it's often a one learner and one tutor, so one computer setting. And the effect sizes are almost as those of human tutor and human tutee. So they can be quite effective. And they often adapt learning, or they often adapt instruction by means of scaffolding prompts. So there's some that adapt the content, there's some that adapt the design of the content, and then there's quite a few that offer scaffolding prompts. So they will have some adaptive model running in the back, realizing okay, the learner needs a bit more help, maybe not, and then adapt the scaffolds. And generally, we assume, and also some studies have found that these scaffolding prompts will promote learning. It's kind of like a teacher or tutor who will give some feedback, some scaffolds. It's okay, maybe you should read a bit more about this, maybe you should do that, or maybe you should try to solve this, kind of like that. And if the learner then does it, then usually they will do it. However, the learners don't always do what we want them to do, and this is the same for these technologies. So just because we give them the prompt, they might not comply with it. That's like prompt compliance is when the learner follows the prompt, and non-compliance is they don't. So we see that, again, emotions have to do something with that, as research has shown that negative emotions, negative effect on the situation levels, not just in general, but particularly when the prompt is being delivered, if they have more negative emotions than positive in that moment, they tend to not follow the prompt. Also, if they're stressed or have increased affective activation, they may not actually follow the prompts. It's not clear why, and it's also not clear how they use it or if they even use it. Particularly in our studies, sometimes when we talk to the learners, we felt like they didn't really want to use the prompt, or they didn't really notice the prompt. That was particularly the case in the pilot study. So we kind of wanted to look into that as well. And to bring all of that together in this one study, we thought, okay, we're going to go into an ecological classroom setting, And we will test the situated variability in concurrent activity emotions. We will test the situated affective dynamics and interrelations with prompt compliance to see do they follow the prompts, and also then see does that predict their performance in the ITS, will they actually improve. And we did that with 4 emotions, enjoyment, boredom, confusion, and frustration. And we also have the affective activation. So we hypothesized that the retrospective topic-related emotions, so it was about climate change, and we asked them when you usually learn about climate change, how do you feel? We asked them that, we asked the 4 emotions and then their strength. And we assumed that the level of the retrospective emotion will be positively related to the stability as well as the time aggregated level over the whole learning session of the respective concurrent activity emotion. Further, we hypothesized that enjoyment during learning as a positive emotion will be positively predicting prompt compliance, whereas we see a negative prediction of negative emotions, boredom, confusion, and frustration for the stability and the time aggregated levels of prompt compliance, and this also a negative relation between affective activation on the situation level and the stability and the time aggregated levels of prompt compliance. And lastly, we then hypothesized that the concurrent activity related enjoyment as positive emotion and prompt compliance will be positively related to performance, whereas we would assume negative relations between negative emotion. I don't know why boredom somehow got lost, but of course we also assume that for boredom and affective activation. So our study consisted of 83 learners with mean age of like 15 or 16 years old from 5 secondary schools all over, not all over Germany, but from different parts of Germany. And data was assessed during a science week. Actually, we had quite a bit more learners initially, but as I hinted a bit, it's always nice to do ecological classroom data assessment, but it's also quite challenging. So we lost quite a bit of the data because the learners, for example, they equip themselves with the EDA, but they also disequip themselves during the learning tasks. So we lost the EDA data, or they did some other funny things. So yeah, sadly, the data's gone. But anyways, during the science week, learners learned about climate change, and we used an ITS called Betty's Brain. It's developed by Biswas and colleagues in the USA. We translated that to German and then used it in the classrooms. And the ITS Betty's Brain is a classic agent-based or pedagogical agent-based ITS. So there is a peer agent, it's called Betty, that's why it's Betty's Brain. And Betty is like a student that needs some tutoring from the real human student. So the student in the classroom will teach Betty by doing something in the ITS. They have to build a concept map, and this concept map is the brain of Betty. So it's all the concepts and the connections between concepts is Betty's brain. And then there is the tutor agent, who's like a headmaster or teacher, but he's not teaching, he's just there to supervise and guide and offer scaffolding prompts. The whole thing was actually quasi-experimental study. I initially said that it's quite interesting to see whether affect-aware intelligent tutoring systems or adaptive learning technologies can benefit learning. So in our quasi-experimental study, we tested a progressive, that is actually a more traditional approach, a progressive scaffolding hint delivery strategy against an emotionally adaptive hint delivery strategy. So the progressive, or the traditional method, and also quite contradictory, it's based on the performance levels of the learners. If they continuously improve, then the level or the detailedness of the scaffolds tends to not improve. But if they do not improve consecutively, then the detailedness of the prompts will increase steadily. Does that make sense? Just get more detailed over time if the learners do not improve. But if they improve, then the level of detailedness will be reduced. So what we also did is that we took that and tested it against a metrics-driven adaptive model. The metrics consisted of the emotional states as well as the performance. And the idea was that we kind of catch the level of engagement of students. So we designed prompts that would, or not, we did not design prompts, but we designed the metrics so that when learners were closer to task disengagement, for example, they were highly bored, but also highly effective or like highly performing, then they would be under challenged, but close to task disengagement, because boredom is a emotion that's closely associated with task disengagement. Whereas if someone was low performing and also bored, they were also close to task disengagement, but they would get a different prompt just based on where they are basically in terms of cognitive and affective states. However, we did not really find significant differences in the outcomes for the sample, so that gave us the option to treat the sample as one within the analysis that I'm presenting. But just so you know, technically we tested something. Oh yeah, it's a multimodal longitudinal design. So the science week started off with an introduction to the ITS, how does it work, so that learners actually know what they're doing. I'm not sure about Australia, but these type of technologies are not very widespread in Germany. So learners have never really worked with them. So that's why we gave them an introduction. We also assessed their socio-demographics and topic-related emotions, and that was followed by an in-system tutorial so that we could make sure that they have the time they need to understand software, because what's the point of them understanding the software? And then we're assessing some data. And that was followed by several learning sessions. Each learning session consisted of around 60 minutes, where they worked with the ITS, they taught virtual peer agent, they received the scaffolds. And during that time, we also assessed their emotions every 10 minutes, the ones that I mentioned. We assessed their affective activation by means of EDA as a continuous measurement, and then also their prompt compliance. We took that from the log file data. Actually, the learners could work for up to 5 sessions with the ITS, but most of them didn't need that many and were done with the task after it. Yeah, and then following all of that, by the end of the science week, we did a collective debrief. The learners could ask us questions about the study. We could talk about it, anything like that. And we also assessed their performance by means of a standardized knowledge test. Voilà. Actually, from the other actually used. So just to give you a better overview of the data assessment, this is supposed to represent 1 hour session with the ITS. And then every 10 minutes, we ask them, how are you feeling? So it's like emotion, how are you feeling? They needed to rate the intensity of their current enjoyment, boredom, confusion, and frustration. After that, they received a scaffolding prompt, because now we had assessed their data, their emotions, and based on that, we could deliver them emotionally adaptive scaffolds. And then while they were reading the prompt, we looked at the EDA data with a 3-second latency. That is because EDA has approximately 3-second latency window until it gets reactive. So we had an event, and then it's about 3 seconds later, and then we can see that in the data. So that's why we have 3-second latency. And then we looked at the EDA that is associated with them reading the prompt. So it starts 3 seconds after they start reading the prompt, and it ends 3 seconds after they end reading the prompt. And we did that for 5 time points during the session. That is just the scales that we use, but yes, we can just skip that. So for the analysis, we specify 2-level dynamic structure equation models, 1 for each emotion, so that they are not conflicting with each other, and also to deal with the sample size. We modeled on the within level there, we modeled autoregressive and cross-lagged effects. And we also modeled the slopes and the time aggregated levels of, it's a bit tiny probably, but we have that for the concurrent activity emotions, for the affective activation, and for the prompt compliance. So the cross-lagged and the slopes here are all for these 3. And then time aggregated levels are also for time aggregated level of the specific emotion, of affective activation, and from compliance. And then we also have the retrospective emotion and performance, and we did that in M+8 2010. The results are not exactly what we expected, but in terms of the situational stability, all emotions in itself were quite stable during the learning session. Same goes for the from compliance. So once they started to be from compliant, basically they would remain from compliant, whereas if they were not from compliant, they would remain rather non-compliant. On the between level, we see that the retrospective topic rate of boredom and confusion significantly positively related to the respective time aggregated levels of the slopes of the concurrent activity rated boredom and confusion. So we didn't find that for frustration and enjoyment, but we found when they started learning and they already had this idea, okay, I'm usually bored, I'm usually confused when I learn about climate change, that would translate to the levels of these two emotions during learning. We also found that the affective activation, although unrelated to all the other stuff, basically, significantly negatively related to performance, so that they were the higher the level of aggregated, higher the level of affective activation during learning, the lower their performance in the end. And then also, we found that the aggregated concurrent activity related boredom, in addition to affective activation, negatively predicted their performance. So when the worst case scenario would be you have a learner that is highly activated and highly bored at the same time, although boredom is technically a low activation state. That would be detrimental for the learning outcome measured by means of performance. So just that's always been a bit hard to grasp. I hope that's a better way of grasping it. That is what we modeled there on the side. And then for enjoyment, what we found is that current enjoyment and from compliance, they basically are very stable over time. And then we found that affective activation negatively related to performance. The model of frustration also shows the stability of frustration on the situation level, as well as from compliance, and that affective activation will negatively relate to performance. For confusion, we now additionally find that it is related to the time aggregated levels of confusion during learning, but also to the stability of affective activation. But we also need to see that the slope is itself not significant. Again, we see that affective activation negatively relates to performance. And then lastly, and I find that is the most relevant and interesting one, is boredom. Again, stable over time, but also the stability is positively predicted by boredom. So by the trait boredom. So when they're initially already bored, their boredom over time, the development will be more stable. So it will be it tends to increase more. And further, the time aggregated levels of boredom are also positively predicted by that. And then again, affective activation negatively relates to performance, and also overall boredom levels negatively related to performance. Okay, so what does that mean? What kind of sense do we make out of this? Emotions and from compliance are set when once they are established, they will just continue to exist. In line with what we have assumed initially, our study points towards the notion that affective activation, at least in our case, can be detrimental to learning, possibly because it depletes or drains cognitive resources such as working memory capacity. The topic-related boredom, so the initial idea of the emotion when they think about the topic, tends to spill over to the states, the situated emotions for learning, for confusion and boredom. And that also highlights that, at least for these two emotions, it's also relevant to consider what kind of, I don't like to use the word mindset, but I'm lacking a better term, but what kind of mindset do learners have when they think about a task and then go into the task? And lastly, boredom as a topic related and also as then spilled into concurrent activity emotion is particularly detrimental to learning, which might not be new, but the data shows it quite nicely. From compliance may not be driven by emotional experiences. And it also did not drive emotional experiences. That does not really align with what we have in the literature so far. But when we looked into from compliance, we saw that generally the compliance was rather low. Only 25% of all situations that we had from all learners followed the prompt, whereas usually they would just disregard it, not acknowledging it, don't care, don't see, I don't know. But they would not follow it. So what we ask ourselves, did they actually understand the prompts? Did they find them useful? Was it too hard to read? Was it too long? Was it too short? Was it the wrong timing? We cannot answer these questions, but they might be relevant to future research. And on a more positive note, we find that the study is a nice, not highlight, but is a nice example of using multimodal approaches to uncover certain levels or certain components of emotional experiences as relevant to learning processes, particularly when we look into the situation level, not just on a time aggregated level, although we mostly find any relevant relations from the between person level, but we at least see that there's some stability and relevance on the between person level. The limitations is usually the sample size could be bigger, but it's mainly due to the challenges that we face in the ecological classroom setting. So it's kind of this, okay, now we have that in the ecological classroom setting, but our data is not as good. That's just the way it is, I guess, in our case. The low prompt compliance may also be indicative of the ITS not being as effective or suitable to the learner's needs. So we would also love to look into that in the future. And also the interval of the ESM data, so the experience sampling data may not be sufficient to capture transient emotions because we have this big window between them. We have one measurement and 10 minutes later we have another measurement, but we don't know what happens in between. Maybe there was some response of surprise or frustration at another point of time, and it has been resolved since. So it's not reflected in our data, but it might have had implications for prompt compliance or other learning behavior. We also did not assess neutral valenced emotions, although there has been research that has shown that they are actually the most dominant during prolonged learning. The relevance for future research might be also interesting to discuss, I don't know. Boredom, particularly when it persists, can be detrimental. That might not be super new, but again, we find that this study shows quite well how persistent boredom can be from a retrospective emotion at the beginning of learning task that will then spill over to its stability, also the levels of boredom, which will then directly relate to their learning outcomes when, as measured in the knowledge test. The prompt comprehension, or at least the issue of prompt comprehension that where we have some indication of, is something that we should definitely investigate in the future. Because although we assume that when we give them scaffolds, that will be helpful, that is a good thing. But what if they don't actually use the prompts, if they don't understand them, then we could also just not offer them scaffolding if it's not useful. So it would be relevant to see when are the prompts actually useful. Maybe that's related to emotional experiences, maybe something else. Another thing that we have discussed in the lab more recently is if we see negative emotions as prevalent emotions or generally high levels of affective activation, maybe as technically it's possible to use that real-time data to adapt within such ITS. Maybe that could be used as information for the ITS to offer some emotion regulation strategies. Maybe ask them, okay, you're highly activated right now. Maybe don't phrase it like that, but ask them to take a quick break, do some breathing exercises, or to step away from the task, or something like that. Yeah, and I said the higher. But again, this is also something I have like not buried in my heart. It's close to my heart is multimodal data, situated studies. They may not be the only way forward, but I think they're very important to better understand emotions, emotional processes during learning. So thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, go ahead. And I'm open to collaboration or questions, anything. Thank you for your attention.
Questions? Good.
Two questions. One, did you look at reciprocal relations over time from the different emotions? Did one emotion lead to another? And I kind of missed went over that fairly quickly. Were there clear patterns of reciprocal effects?
I wish we could have done that properly. However, the models did not support several emotions within one model. So we could not really look into how they are interrelated. There is some research on these emotions that show like clear patterns between them. For example, that when you're hitting an obstacle in your learning, that you will be confused by that, and then if you solve the issue or like the obstacle, you will feel enjoyment. But if you do not, then at some point it will become frustration. At some point, it will become boredom. We wanted to look into that, but the models were not able to specify the models.
You had 4 emotions,
Yeah.
5 waves. Couldn't you do a cross-like panel model?
We chose to model dynamic relations, so we chose to model the slope as to not have, although a slope is also not super like curvilinear, but we chose to not just do linear relations.
Okay.
So, but yeah, it's just that our choice that we didn't model that.
What is it about effective activation? Why is that? What is it that's actually being measured there?
You mean in terms of physiological measurement?
No, I got to make, I know how you measure it. I saw that, but what's it actually mean?
So it's
Why is it negatively related to achievement? Why isn't it related to any of the self-report?
So it's one component of emotions, and that can differ between emotions, but it can also differ within one emotion. So it's this, I think the best way to describe it is to ask people to imagine the ones they were in love really, really badly, the first love maybe, or when they are going to take a test. There will be something happening in their body, and it's very hard to explain, but it's some kind of physical feeling that you cannot control. It's just happening. Might be some tickling or some tingling.
So like jittery?
It can be jittery, like heart rate is also related, or it's also a part of the physiological response, but it's not measured by what we have measured. What we have measured is not stress, but it's closely related to stress. So it's the level of how you are activated, not engaged, as part of the emotion. For example, if you look at boredom, boredom is generally understood as a low activation state. But there have also been studies that show that there's different levels of activation within boredom. And that then within boredom, like there is a more neutral type of boredom that is not too negative, but still negative. And then there's also low arousal type, low activation type, but also high activation type of boredom.
I understand boredom is a tricky one because you can be lost and quit, or you can be understimulated and be bored. Yeah, no, I'm bored. Is there a self-report measure that you could get that I'm just curious that we get the activation, effective activation? What would be the self-report measure that would correlate with it?
There are some studies that just asked, they did self-report measures. But I don't have the wording at the top of my head, but I would assume it's something that needs to discriminate the construct that's being asked for from cognitive engagement. So it could be something like how, like the physiological part, like how maybe jittery. Yeah, maybe it could be jittery, like how jittery do you feel? Because it also needs to be relatable for learners to grasp the concept.
I mean, the lack of relationship is kind of damning, but I can't quite tell. It's no relationship because you're measuring different components of emotion, or because the physiological and self-report don't match.
It could be that. It could also be that when we ask about specific emotions, that they imagine, okay, like how bored am I? How much do I enjoy the task? How confused am I? And that is all taking like the mixed emotions apart, whereas the physiological response will be the result of all simultaneous emotions happening or existing, and that would then be like the level of affective activation will be the result of the level of affective activation of all the emotions at one time.
So you should be able to predict it with a profile of emotions.
Which we didn't do, but that's a very good idea.
The one fourth thing is related to importance. If something important to your well-being is happening, you'll see a marker. And if it's something that's not important to you, you won't see a marker.
Okay.
It's not emotion, it's just, it's relevant to your well-being or not.
Any other questions? Thanks, sir. Marshall?
Could you explain that I think the scaffolds and the prompts were meant to affect the emotions. So I was wondering why, it seems like if you wanted to change people's confusion, frustration, you would give them a prompt that could do that. But you asked them to explain it to Betty. Why not give me something that would alleviate my boredom or increase my enjoyment or decrease my confusion, like a tip or something like, why not that?
The prompts were not actually meant to help them regulate their emotions. They were meant to give them, it's more like cognitive scaffolding. So based on their emotional and cognitive state, or in the control condition, just on their performance, we assumed or assessed how under-challenged, over-challenged they were kind of related to Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. Is out of their zone in terms of it's too simple, or is it out of their zone because it's too hard, or is it just right? And the prompts were designed as a hint or as a tip to help them progress. That could be, okay, maybe you should read a bit more on this topic, or maybe you should look into this topic, or maybe you could edit this part of the concept map. This part of the concept map doesn't look right. Maybe you should check it. Maybe you should read more. These kind of so it was not, although it was assumed to improve their emotional experiences if they are not like stuck. Also, if it's not too easy, but it was not designed to help them regulate or reappraise, anything like that. It was just designed to give them an adequate level of difficulty. But there has been, like, we've been talking a lot now about whether it makes more sense to offer scaffolds that help them actively regulate their emotions or think about their emotions, or if it would have been more beneficial to give them more cognitive prompts. Because we didn't test that, I don't have any results on that, but it would definitely be interesting to see what is actually more helpful. Is it cognition, or is it emotion in terms of prompt content?
Other questions? Teresa?
First, thank you for the very interesting presentation and cool research with cool gadgets. If you were to change one thing in that project or setup, what would it be? Leading to what your next step would be, like what would you do after you have learned all about what you have?
I think the most important part, and there's also something I've been thinking more recently about since I gave a talk at University of Sydney, is whether the data should always be within an ecological classroom. So we have some lower quality data maybe, or if it should actually be in a lab setting, so we have ecological, non-ecological valid data, but good data where we have more control. And I think it would be that actually. Maybe we could still do the research in a more real school setting, but maybe not in a classroom where there's 30 participants and they're all working on it. And we simply cannot control that they talk to each other, because then maybe the prompts were not helpful anymore because they already had talked to a peer, human peer. And that helped them to continue. And it would also be would have been so much easier for us to notice if they're playing around with the EDA and we're losing the data. So I think a lab setting would help answer these research questions better in the future.
I would imagine the peer to be more of a source of emotion than the prompts.
Maybe also that yeah, but then maybe it would have also been an idea to do video recordings and then see whether learners talk to each other a lot, or maybe, I mean, it's probably not really feasible to get that data, but what are they talking about? Does that have an impact? Do they suddenly solve an issue that they've been working on for 5 minutes and they haven't solved it, but now they've talked to their friend and the friend gave them a hint? And what type of hint did the friend give them? And did that help or not? That would also be quite interesting, and might also help design better prompts, scaffolding prompts.
Any other questions? All right, so first before Anja finishes, so she's almost ready to submit her thesis. So my understanding is it'll be early in the new year. At Potsdam, she actually has to do a thesis defense. But given how you handled yourself here with all the questions from Herb, Teresa, and John Marshall, I think you'll fly through your thesis defense quite well. So last but not least, I'd like to give you a couple of presents from Australia. So these are Tim Tams. I'm not sure if you know about these.
Yeah, I've had them.
But you might.
Oh, I've heard of that.
All right, you said that. And this is just the IPPE mug that you said, oh, you like the blue IPPE mug as well. So, right, so please give a round of applause. Well done, thanks, Alex. Just a couple of quick announcements before everybody goes. First of all, we have one more brown bag for the year next Wednesday, which is Dr. Jacqueline Mayer from Singapore ETH, who's going to be hosted by Associate Professor Taryn Sanders and the birthday boy, Chris Lonsdale. I think it's his birthday today, isn't it? It is. There you go. Happy birthday, Chris. It's a milestone one, apparently. 30. 30? 30. 30. She's turned 30 today. I know it's a milestone one. And also, if you can make it for our staff on Friday, I know Friday's usually nobody's here except for me. It's the VC's talk on Friday. So if you just want to come in and harass the VC, please come on in and harass the VC, especially about research-only positions. Ron is ready to give him a few questions already. And last but not least, Ron has already deputised me to say this. So we have a lot of, once you get to the top as a professor, the university decided we need some more Uber professors. So the VC has signed off on 4 ACU MacKillop Distinguished Professors. And of course, as you mostly know, this institute actually has 2 of those 4 professors. And I'd like to give a round of applause to Herb Marsh, who is one of our inaugural ACU MacKillop Distinguished Professors. Now we have to bow. Well, we always do bow to her, but now we're moving on. So, and of course, the other one, of course, is Rich Ryan. And next time we see Rich, we'll make sure that we congratulate him as well. Thanks very much. Thanks, Anja. Perfect. And thanks very much. A great afternoon. Thanks, everyone. Yes.